These strange and creepy mysteries have puzzled investigators and amateur sleuths alike. In each case, a number of potential solutions have been put forward, but there's nothing to make anybody certain about the answer to these creepy unsolved cases. Number 5. In 2007, workers at Nokia received an email warning of a threat that could have crippled the devices of millions of people. More than 25 years on, who ransomed 2 million euros from the tech giant remains a mystery. At the time, Nokia was still a dominant player in the mobile phone market, with a market share of just under 50%. Millions of people around the world used their phones, whether the older devices or newer smartphones that could run various applications. Official app stores as we know them didn't exist yet, and apps were downloaded from the developer websites or other places on the internet. That posed a challenge to phone developers who didn't want malware to be downloaded. For Nokia, any apps needed a certificate that was signed by the company to say that they were clean and safe to be used. In October of 2007, an employee at Nokia received an email from an extortionist who claimed to have the encryption key for Symbian, the operating system Nokia used and licensed to other manufacturers. The key would allow unauthorized applications to be installed on Nokia devices. Putting out a fix wouldn't be simple, as the forged certificates would still be read as valid until their expiration date. The extortionist claimed that they would release the encryption key to other hackers in Finland and around the world if their demands weren't met. They also warned Nokia not to contact the police. Nokia did speak with Finland's National Bureau of Investigation, but asked that they not begin investigating until they had changed the encryption keys. Normally, it's not advised to pay ransoms in cases like this. It's seen only as encouraging hackers to do this sort of thing in the future. But given how widespread the potential consequences could have been, it was seen as better to just stop that from happening as quickly as possible. The ransom demand was in 2 parts. The first was $1.6 million to be left in the parking lot of an inland marina in central Finland. The second was for 2 donations of $200,000, each to be made to 2 charities, one supporting pediatric neurology research, and the other a Helsinki-based childhood disease research foundation. The 2 donations were made, and the larger sum of money was left as instructed. Police watched the drop spot, but lost track of the culprits who collected it. Only a little more information has ever been uncovered. Police were able to trace the IP address that sent the extortion messages, and found that SMS messages had been sent from a Nokia 6691 that was bought at a second-hand phone store in Helsinki. The culprits have never been found, and their motives remain a mystery. Even the question of how the criminals got the encryption key in the first place has never been answered. Number 4. The Franklin expedition to find the Northwest Passage is one of the most famous mysterious expeditions. When the 1845 expedition failed to return, a total of 32 rescue expeditions were sent out. They couldn't solve the mystery of what had happened to them, but did recover countless items from the 2 ships that were lost in the Arctic. Papers, abandoned clothes, equipment, and tents were all located, but missing was a single chronometer. It was believed lost until 2009. The ship's chronometer was a very important piece of equipment needed to calculate a ship's longitude. They were expensive and important, and the ones on Franklin's ships were government property. The missing chronometer was referred to as Arnold 294, Arnold being the maker and 294 being the number. The Royal Observatory kept a ledger noting when each chronometer was issued from the observatory. In 1837, Arnold 294 was noted as leaving on the Beagle on its 3rd voyage, surveying parts of Australia. The next entry was almost 50 years later and simply read "Lost in Arctic regions with the Erebus." It would never return. The observatory hadn't issued the Arnold to the Erebus directly, but authorities had been able to trace the path this piece of equipment had followed between the Beagle's return and the Erebus's departure. In 1999, a Victorian-era carriage clock went up for auction. It had the name Arnold, which attracted attention. Nobody suspected anything unusual about the clock, but Arnold clocks were of high quality, and the observatory decided to buy this piece of history. It would be another 10 years before anybody looked inside the clock and discovered something astonishing. It was Arnold 294. It had been forced into a carriage clock casing, complete with a crudely attached handle, but the chronometer inside was still perfect. There were no signs that it had spent any amount of time lost in the Arctic. According to experts, even being exposed to the elements for a day would have caused the device to begin to corrode. There was evidence that someone had tried to hide the device's identity. Not only had it been converted into a clock, but the name Arnold had been beaten flat on the dial and replaced with the name Reynolds & Son, a company that may not have existed. In the 1970s, someone had realized that the clock had been an original Arnold, but didn't know how significant this specific Arnold was. They restored the name, allowing the observatory to notice it when it came up for auction years later. How the Arnold came to be in London and lost in the Arctic is a mystery. This sort of device couldn't have gone missing without anybody noticing, but none of the letters from the Erebus note anything strange about any of the equipment. Stealing such a device could have landed the culprit in a penal colony in Australia, so it would have been a big risk to commit the crime. Number 3. In early February of 2015, conditions on Ben Nevis, a mountain in Scotland, were perfect for climbers. But as the adventurous made their way up and down the mountain, the normal sounds of snow, ice, and animals were cut through by a terrifying sound. Those that heard the noise described it as a blood-curdling scream. Multiple climbing groups dotted about the mountain and heard the noise and felt the horror that the source of the noise must have been going through. It lasted for about 5 minutes and was described as stationary, coming from a single spot in the mountains. When the sound stopped, some claimed to have heard a woman crying. A few of the groups tried to make their way to the spot where they thought the sound had come from. For most that had heard the noise, they believed something truly terrible had happened. Ben Nevis isn't the hardest to climb, with it being described as suitable for beginners. But like any mountain, it can be dangerous. Since 1849, over 100 people have lost their lives on the mountain, including one in 2023. One climber on the mountain that day claimed that he believed he was listening to someone who had just watched their loved one fall. But when other climbers went to try to help the individuals in trouble, they found nothing. Mountain rescue services were also called, but they found no sign of any trouble. No missing climbers were reported either. After the incident, people speculated in forums about what they could have heard. Some claimed to have heard someone calling for a tightrope shortly before the screaming started. Whether that was connected isn't clear. One of the theories put forward was that it may have been TV presenter and adventurer Bear Grylls. He had allegedly been filming in the area around the same time, and people thought it may have been for attention. However, people working on the show confirmed he hadn't been on the mountain that day. The possibility that it was simply an animal was also suggested. Some animals can make noises that sound scarily similar to human screams, but those that heard the noise insisted that it wasn't an animal. It may have been the initial instinct of the climbers was right. This was the sound of someone who believed they had just watched their loved one fall, but they hadn't recovered. They were then too embarrassed to come forward. However, it wasn't simply one scream, and the person would had to have been mistaken for 5 minutes before learning their loved one hadn't fallen. Unless anybody comes forward as the culprit, it's likely this strange mystery will never be solved. Number 2. On the night of July 13th, 2010, an ordinary-looking container arrived at Vulturi Terminal Europa. It was one of thousands that would arrive on that day and looked like any other. But inside the container was a dangerous and strange material that remains a mystery to this day. It wouldn't be until a week later that anybody realized how strange this container was. The container was 6 meters long and red in color. It had no distinguishing features other than its container code of TGHU 307703-022G1. When it had arrived at the port, its paperwork stated that it had a cargo of scrap metal and was set to be shipped to the foundry, where it would presumably be melted down and turned into something useful. It was placed in a stack of countless other containers to wait its turn to be checked and moved on to its destination. Finally, on July 20th, that process began. It was moved to an area with 10 other containers to be scanned for any radioactive material. there are plenty of ordinary objects that emit higher than normal levels of radiation. Brazil nuts, ceramics, and bananas can all trigger some radiation detectors, so it wouldn't be unusual for detectors to make the odd noise at the dock. But when port workers approached this red mystery container, the detector indicated radioactivity off the charts. It was beyond the highest reading on the machine. At first, the workers believed they had a faulty detector, but after changing the wires, it was clear there was something dangerous in the container. When 23 meters away, the detector measured radiation levels up to 0.1 per hour. Radiation workers in the US are only permitted to be exposed to levels of up to 50 per year. The container was moved to an unused area of the dock, and a 200-meter exclusion zone was put up around it. Even at that distance, there was a radiation level 4 times that of background radiation levels. The container had come to Italy from Saudi Arabia. There, it had been used by a scrap metal company based in the United Arab Emirates. The container was filled with radiators and coils of copper wires, and a photo was taken before the doors were shut and sealed. It was then driven by truck to Jeddah in June or early July, and placed on a ship headed to Genoa. A year-long debate over what should be done with the container took place, as nobody wanted to take responsibility. Eventually, a robot was sent into the container to locate the radioactive object. It turned out to be a small cylinder of cobalt, the sort of thing that would be used in medical or food sterilization devices. It was 20 centimeters long and less than a centimeter in diameter, and had no obvious markings. The rest of the material in the container was just ordinary scrap metal. The radioactive cylinder was taken to Germany, where investigators tried to get to the bottom of where it had come from, and how it had become mixed in with the scrap metal, but so far that remains a mystery. Number 1. The case of Dorothy Eerie is possibly one of the best examples of reincarnation. If she wasn't an ancient Egyptian priestess born in the early 1900s, how she came to know so many details about the time period is a mystery. Dorothy was born in 1904 in London to Irish parents. When she was 3 years old, she fell down the stairs. According to some sources, her parents were told she actually passed away, but then came back. Other sources claimed she suffered a serious and rare brain condition. Whichever is true, Dorothy was different after her fall. She told her parents she wanted to go home, but that wasn't the house where she'd been living all her life. She couldn't explain what it was. Less than a year later, the family visited the British Museum, and Dorothy became fascinated with the Egyptian room. She spotted a photo of the Temple of Seti I in Abydos, Egypt, and told her family that this was her home, though the gardens she was familiar with were missing. She also said that the mummies there were her people. Dorothy's fascination with ancient Egypt and her belief that it had once been her home didn't fade as she grew up. She started studying the subject at a young age and quickly learned to read hieroglyphics. At church, she would compare Catholicism to her old religion, and at school, she refused to sing a hymn in which God punished the ancient Egyptians. Despite it causing friction between Dorothy and the rest of her community, she never gave up her beliefs. According to her, Seti I would come to her at night and tell her about her old life. Her old name had been Bentrishit, and she lived in the Temple of Abydos from a young age. She'd been the daughter of one of Seti's soldiers, and when she was 12, she became a priestess. But she would later begin a relationship with the pharaoh himself and lost her life. Dorothy couldn't explain why she had been reborn, but she believed she would be reunited with her loved one in the afterlife at the end of this life. As an adult, Dorothy moved to Egypt and married an Egyptian man. She had a son who she named Seti, and started going by the name Seti. While in Egypt, she was in contact with archaeologists, scholars, and experts in the field studying the world she claimed to remember. Strangely, none were able to trip her up. She led them to the site of the garden that she remembered at Abydos, which hadn't yet been discovered, and was able to describe artifacts that had not yet been made public. While the manner in which she worked was very unusual, she was respected by other Egyptologists, and even the famous Kenneth Kitchen allegedly believed her story. In 1956, she became the first woman to work in the Antiquities Department of Abydos, and moved into the temple. There, she would spend the rest of her life before passing away in 1981. Years later, How Dorothy knew what she knew remains a mystery. Reincarnation seems unlikely, but there are few other explanations. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.